Rappin with ReefBum is sponsored by Polo Reef and Champion Lighting and Supply. Hey, welcome back to the show. My name is Keith, and there is Don.
My name is Don.
Oh, we're getting a little frisky there now, huh, Don? How you doing, man?
Very good, very good.
What's
hot outside?
A little too hot outside. I can relate.
Too hot outside.
But it's cool inside, right?
Oh yeah, and also very low humidity. Right now it's only 50%.
Inside, but outside it's got to be like close to 100%, right?
Yep.
Yeah, no, I know. I got my dehumidifier running in my basement pretty much the majority of the day, and then sometimes I'll kick on the AC. But it's been nasty the last couple of weeks.
Oh
yeah. Northeast.
Yeah, the humidity killing me.
Yeah. So how's everything going with the tanks, the corals?
Oh, everything going well.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the tanks are only 77.
They're only 77. How's the project? How's the project tank doing there behind you?
Doing pretty good, and there's some changes there because I saw some people bought some coral right out of there, so I just put some new one in there. So it works pretty well.
You've got plenty to swap into that tank, right?
Oh, there's a tons of coral waiting to be seen in this tank.
Now, what happened to the big raceway tank that sprung a leak? Did you replace it?
Actually, right now there's a 2 tank there. One of them is 80 gallon. The other one is a low boy, and they're all set up, but one of them is still dry.
Watch out for that low boy.
Oh, actually, this low
personal
boy
experience with that leaking on me.
Yep. This one is tested. It's battle hardened.
There you go. Well, I'm looking forward to the show tonight because we're going to be talking about coral pests, identifying, managing, preventing coral pests, and we've got Kevin Burda on from Top Shelf Aquatics, and those guys at Top Shelf Aquatics just have an incredible quarantine system set up, and so they're really they have to be on top of this stuff, and they can't have that stuff get into their main system. So I'm really very psyched to have Kevin on so we can kind of grill him with some questions and hopefully learn a lot. And then we also have Dr. Alex J. Hall on, who's an aquatic veterinarian, and I've had him on the show before. So we're going to really kind of get into the nitty gritty. Alex is running a little bit late. He's working up until 7 o'clock. So, but I'm going to bring on Kevin right here. Kevin.
Hi, Kevin,
man.
Good seeing you guys.
Yeah. Welcome to the show,
dude.
Good
to see you. Welcome.
Yeah. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So we're we really want to kind of tap into your expertise there, Kevin, because as I mentioned just earlier, you guys have how many different quarantine systems do you have? I mean, you've got backups to backups, right?
Yeah, I would essentially say the main way we do things is we would have systems that we would consider intake systems, where the wild coral would go first, and then we would do visual inspections upon arrival, making sure that we look over every inch of that coral. We use jeweler's specs with magnifiers to really get in there in detail. A lot of times chop the bases off. The goal being that there just wouldn't be anything that we can't see on that, ideally. And then at that point, if we identify things with issues, we would treat it. And in addition, we pretty much dip everything that goes in, no matter what, regardless, with different types of dips. But if there are things that we do stumble upon, we would have different procedures that we would do to isolate those and that sort of thing. Once they go into the intake systems, then we would run through weekly inspections, continual dips. A lot of times too, we would treat with other chemicals with a broad system treatment as well, something like Interceptor to debug these things, because we have been seeing a lot more different types of pests coming in, like pods, specifically ones that aren't what you would typically expect that they would be preying on. The typical use would be more, red bugs. Then white bugs came along on your acros. Those were probably the main reasons why most reefers were actually using Interceptor. Well, we've been finding some different ones even coming in on things like Euphilia and, feeding on a whole broad range of different coral species, which is, to be honest, a little frustrating and scary when it comes to the way we run our system. So this would be all done during our intake tanks, within those intake tanks. And then at that point, after your typically consecutive treatments, 3 weeks, when the chemicals are still in the water, pests would have dropped off. Any potential eggs at that point would have dropped off. They would have ran through their life cycle. They would be transferred out of that system. And that's a big key to our process, is tank transfers. So at that point, they would go to what we would consider the soft quarantine systems, when they've been proven to be clean. And, for the most part, I would say that's probably more along the standards of what a lot of people may do. But for our systems in the farm, at this point, we've been collecting for years and years and years. So, being that we sell to people all over the country who are collectors themselves, who have large displays with, slews of different corals in there, we just have to hold ourselves to a really, really strict standard. So, even once it makes it to the pre-quarantine tanks, then we let it settle, grow out, constantly inspect it there as well. And then usually break it up into, multiple mini colonies, that sort of thing. And then we have completely isolated quarantine systems that don't hold anything consistently. So they're left fallow. And once we run a batch through, we'll usually get certain species that will cycle through, do specific treatments for those. Again, continually going through that whole process of the visual inspections, the regular dips, and the broad system treatments as well. And then we would also pretty much rinse, repeat, redo that whole process again a second time before they ever make it into our fully quarantined systems. Just because you never want that human error, that risk factor to make it through. Or let's say a pest were to get into, your quarantine system. At that point, you could almost consider that first stage tainted in a way, because it's not a guarantee that you're going to be able to catch everything when you're lifting that coral up and dipping it. So, even that part is important for us, to essentially not even put things in a quarantine tank that we think has a pest on it. We use our pre-quarantine intake systems mostly for that. And then, again, at each stage, we're rebasing as well, removing whatever we can, going through every inch. We also use microscopes as well. If we ever, are dealing with corals that have common issues where it might be a pest we might not pick up on the specs. I have people on my team who are just very excellent, and my farm manager Corey. I mean, I joke around, I call him the human microscope. You know, he could just really, you know, hone in and look over every inch of every coral, and has that patience and discipline that it takes to make sure that we don't miss anything. Because, you know, again, when you have multi-thousand-gallon systems just jam-packed with, you know, fields of zoanthids or fields of acropora or fields of montipora or any of these things, if something were to get past that, at that point, where's the bottle of bleach? Or
Yeah.
you'd almost have to, you know, pull everything out and re-quarantine it again, and you know, go through that whole process, because it's just so difficult to control and manage the pest with any real confidence that you're going to be 100%. You know, you might not see it, but they're typically in there, and it's just not a reliable way to go about it. Now, it might not be the most practical thing for the average hobbyist to go to that level, but, you know, being that we're a very large aquaculture facility who's been collecting for years, we just really want to keep our standards top shelf and make sure nothing, you know, slips through. And, you know, even if we do encounter new pests, we take the time to, you know, research with them, experiment on them, test various medications and dips to make sure we really understand how they work, what's lethal to them, you know, how the life cycle is, all these factors that go into successfully coming up with a plan to eradicate them.
So you mentioned, Kevin, the different bugs like red bugs and white bugs and all that sort of thing. You know, just in terms of parasitic copapods, you know, those bugs, what do you guys hit them with, you know, in terms of the corals when you know, whether they have the bugs or not? I mean, is that what you're doing? When you're putting corals under a microscope and you're seeing that they do have some sort of bug on them, then you're hitting them with the interceptor or something else, kind of a you know, more of a catch-all type of thing? Or are you just basically, that's what you're going to do, is all the corals that are coming in are going to get hit with interceptor?
Yeah, so we bring in a lot of the corals, even the ones that might not be, you know, your typical usual suspects for that. And in the past, we would mostly do it on batches of corals that would be, let's say we have an intake of hand-picked wild acros, or a batch of really nice collector named frags that we traded with other vendors or picked up at a coral show or something like that. We would hit those batches during every aspect of the transfer, going from system to system, typically 3 weeks in a row, and then moving them on. Now, I would say in the last year or two, we've been seeing more and more of these pods. And the scarier thing about it is that a lot of them don't just prey on one species of coral. It seems like there's more and more. And I had sent you a slide of what
which one?
What we're calling the white cross bugs. You know, it's essentially
there it is. That's a nasty looking critter.
And that's it illuminated from the back. If you pull up the other slide where you can kind of see it more from a distance on the coral, it would probably be easier to see what you might or visualize what you would see if you were to catch it more on the coral with a really strong magnifier.
I don't see another white cross bug.
It would be more of a pulled back view, I think I sent you, where there's specks on the coral.
I see zoanthid, spider eating, grimace flatworm, grimace eggs, triton. No, Euphilia bug, clove polyp.
They might have labeled it Euphilia bug. You can click on that one. Let's see what that shows. Yeah, that's one of them. But the white cross ones, yeah, you can kind of see it. But yeah, mainly when you're looking at it, they have literally almost an X pattern on them that distinguishes them. That being said, it doesn't really matter. The most important thing is that these seem to prey on a wide range of species. So we've seen them sometimes even on acros, but not very commonly. On Montipora, we've seen them on a slew of different LPS, to the point where it's made us change our protocol, where pretty much everything coming in is getting run through interceptor before it gets moved to different systems for grow out, even if they are pre-quarantine systems, because it's much easier to treat those in an intake system than it is in a much larger system. So it's just not worth the risk. At that point, if we were to run them through even in a holding system that's, 2,000 gallons potentially, and maybe they don't have any issues, but where we're dealing with these things, 1 out of 100 is not good enough for us, because we are moving so much coral in and through our facility, and there's just so many tanks, thousands and thousands of gallons in systems, that if something were to get in there, it's just 1 out of 100 isn't good enough. It has to be 100%. So we've just kind of gone through that procedure now, where we're hitting everything before it gets transferred to the farm. Because the other thing with copapods too, it's just so much easier to transfer those from one system to the other. Having just contaminated tools or a saw, or scooping in a little container if it's not sterilized properly, things like that. You're talking about microscopic little organisms that can reproduce and be planktonic to where they're swimming in the water column. So it's just too risky for us.
Kevin, are you guys finding that Interceptor will pretty much take care of every different type of parasitic copepod that you're seeing, or are there other meds that you're using to get rid of some more peskier bugs?
Yeah, for the pods that we've encountered running a higher dose, and again, the key is to doing repetitive treatments, because if you just hit it once in a tank, they could be carrying eggs. Those eggs drop off in the system. Now it's a waiting game. Maybe something eats them, maybe something doesn't. Maybe they hatch once the treatment's out of the water. But if the treatment isn't lethal at that point and the eggs hatch, then the whole process continues. So that's where it's really important, knowing the life cycle and kind of running through those treatments to transfer and catch those things before that process. So when I say transfer as well, that's a key part of what we do, because once it's hit, in theory, you're killing the adults in the system, and then you would move it. With pods, they don't really lay the eggs on the coral like an acro-eating flatworm or a nudibranch or something like that. So typically, transferring out is also a very effective way to eliminate them. And a lot of times you can even speed up the process too, if it's not as practical to have a QT running that many treatments in a row.
So you're saying basically you hit the tank with the Interceptor and then transfer out the corals right after that treatment, assuming that everything that was treated is pretty much dead, because the only thing that would be left in that tank would be eggs, but those eggs are not necessarily on the corals.
Yeah, it depends on what type of tank you're running. So if you had a tank that you were just gonna nuke or bleach, or maybe even set up a tub or some temporary tank, then you could do probably less treatments and transfer. But for what we're doing on our intake system, sometimes we have certain corals that stay there. So we run the whole course of the treatment, typically 3 weeks, just to make sure 100% that we're going to eradicate that on the different batches of coral when we're getting ready to transfer stuff over to the pre-quarantine systems in the farm. That's just pods. Obviously, there's a whole slew of other pests to deal with. But that's definitely one of the ones that I think may be slipping through the cracks in the hobby, just because they're so hard to see. A lot of times you wouldn't even pick those up on a jeweler's spec. We noticed it more because we were looking really, really close and seeing some signs of stress on the coral. That's where it's very important when you're doing those visual inspections to try to look at every inch, try to look for those signs of predation, just different factors that would lead you to maybe be a little suspicious that there's something there, and put it under the microscope, or just do that out of standard practice. It's a good investment if you're a collector to look over every piece that's going to be going into your display tank.
So, Kevin, do you buy into the? I've heard like there's certain bugs that are just more bulletproof than other bugs, and like black bugs, I think I've heard, can be pretty tough to eradicate. Is that something that you guys have experience with in terms of some bugs being harder to get rid of than others, or pretty much are your repetitive weekly interceptor treatments taking care of all bugs that are coming in?
Yeah, the black bugs are ciliate, so that's a little different. Those guys, man, when they first came out onto the scene, were a real pain in the butt. Most of your standard tips, weren't really that effective for them. We had to try a whole slew of things. Even bear wasn't. Bear is pretty much lethal to almost everything, but it can be a little more stressful, and it's not ideal to use repetitively in a system, especially if you have corals with a significant amount of substrate that can leach it back into the system during those dips. So it's not something you ideally want to use all the time, especially for those types of things. But yeah, that didn't even touch the black bugs. Most of your Coral RX and Revives and those dips weren't really doing an effective job. The real game changer, I'd say, was Reef Primer and potassium chloride based dips were very effective on knocking those off. I mean, we had used really concentrated clouded iodine that was working, but it wasn't really 100%. But yeah, the potassium seems to really knock those guys off very easily. And that made short work of them to, being that it's not really something we worry that much about anymore if we see it coming in.
Hey, Alex, what's out, man? Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, how you guys doing? Just got off of work.
Yeah, no, appreciate you able to make it to the stream. At long day there at the office.
Yeah. Today's a 12-hour day.
Oof.
Oh,
ouch. Well, we're in the middle of talking about parasitic copapods, and Kevin was just kind of talking about. He was talking about Top Shelf Aquatics, multiple layers of their quarantine systems and how they have like intake systems and then other quarantine systems. So just many different facets in terms of trying to prevent any kind of pests to coming into the systems. And I know what at Polo Reef, it's a similar type of thing, right? In terms of the quarantine and multiple layers. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know what's been touched on. So if I'm repeating anyone, just cut me off. But milbemycin oxamine has been, the staple for parasitic copepods. Again, there are other modalities, and I heard iodine and potassium.
So explain that. Is that the same thing as Interceptor?
Yeah, so Interceptor is the trade name, but Interceptor is a mix of milbemycin oxamine and praziquantel with a beef additive. So I'm not a big fan of multiple drug dosing, but acquiring pure milbemycin oxamine can be quite difficult. Fortunately, something that we've been experimenting with is a medication called Moxidectin. What Moxidectin are the big advantages we are supposing with Moxidectin over milbemycin oxamine is that they both are derived from milbemycin, and then you get the milbemycin oxamine, then you get Moxidectin. The nice thing about the Moxidectin is that it's already like water soluble, so you're no longer trying to crush tablets, and the resistance to it is going to be substantially less. As the hobbies use more of the milbemycin, we're seeing more resistant strains of parasitic copepods, black bugs, white bugs, etc. With the Moxidectin, though, there's not going to be any exposure, so natural resistance is going to be less, and there's some peer-reviewed studies in dogs using Moxidectin over milbemycin might be a little bit more effective. So not only is it cheaper than milbemycin oxamine, it's already water soluble, and treating on a large scale might be a lot easier. So it's something that we're experimenting with, potentially moving forward. As again, acquiring pure milbemycin oxamine can be quite the challenge. And again, I'm not a big fan of mixing drugs, especially with the praziquantel and that beef additive. Again, am I being over paranoid with that? Probably, but having a water soluble solution and something that's potentially more potent and cheaper is a win for me. So that should be coming out relatively shortly on those experiments.
So
can I
go ahead?
Sorry.
Go ahead. No,
so can I get them from a vet?
So yes, right. So it is a veterinary only medication. That being said, it really comes down to if the vet is comfortable prescribing that medication. And some vets are, some aren't. Again, when you when you go to your vet and you ask for a specific, very specific drug and you got to explain to them what, red bugs are. A lot of them tend not to want to go down that road. But there are vets that do prescribe interceptors. So I think that prescribing Moxidectin may be something viable in the future.
Dong, you've got a dog, right?
Yeah, I got a dog. Yep.
Yeah,
I got 4
so
cats.
just make
and a
something
dog.
up.
No, I cannot. they know me too well.
And there are studies out there involving corals as well. So the vet we work with, we essentially provided them the detailed paperwork for those peer-reviewed studies, and had to deal with a few to find one that was willing to deal with us on that scale. And it's not something we're able to sell or anything like that, but they do have to do, many times a site visit and that sort of thing. But, if it's on a small scale and you're just trying to get some for your home, maybe you could work with that. We're treating thousands of gallons, and I'm sure Alex is in the same boat there, that it's, a little harder than
It's
doing
hard.
it at home.
Yeah, it's hard to walk in and ask for 600 tablets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was actually able to talk my country vet into prescribing some interceptor for me. I told him exactly what I needed it for, and he was cool. Yeah. But
I don't want to be quoted saying this, but country vets are generally pretty cool. So they'll work with you. And again, they're dealing with things on a different day-to-day basis than like a small animal practitioner. So that's actually probably a pretty good way of going about it. So, I mean,
I've gotten interceptor before from like Canada. There was like some website called somebody maybe in the chat could put it CanadianVet.com or something like that. I don't know what it was, but is that an option? Because I haven't tried to tap into those guys in a long time. I'm not even sure that website is still around or that's available. But for those of us that can't talk our veterinarian into prescribing interceptor, are there other options that you guys know? Any Dong, Kevin, Alex?
I mean, there's lots of things you can get from pharmacies outside of the country. It's just trusting it. So I would probably be cautious. Do some test treatments in a smaller tank or something like that, or a testing vessel that you set up with a heater and a power head, rather than treating your whole display tank with it. Just to be cautious with that. But we did bring some stuff in before from China direct and that sort of thing when we were getting the pure milbemycin oxamine. So it is possible.
Barry says, why a dog laugh at? That was what I was going to show. RE Idaho Reef, I ordered from Canada last year. It took like 3 weeks to get. Yeah, it does take a long time. Reefer Fish, yes, still available. They ship out of Australia. So I guess that's doable. I got the chews. Is there any difference between the beef chews versus just straight up interceptor?
Messy.
As for no. So again, most of them have that beef flavoring because they're selling palatability to dogs. So getting the pure product is difficult without going through extended avenues. Again, I could get small, like when I say small, like small quantities of pure product, but the cost is astronomical. And if you do try to buy too much, you'll get flagged by the agricultural department, which I learned the hard way. And I was going through one of the compounding pharmacies. Getting small quantities, you can try to get your vet to like custom compound, but it's going to be incredibly expensive. And are the potential rare side effects of using the beef chews worth the extra cost of the pure product? And that's up for debate.
Yeah, another option is a Milba Guard too. I believe is a different version of it that is a decent amount cheaper too. Last we had checked, so maybe look into that one as well, depending on your availability.
Reefer Fish is asking, what's the trade name for Moxidectin? Tim, is that how you pronounce that?
Moxidectin.
Moxidectin. Okay.
So I don't believe there's any pure like Moxidectin products besides ordering Moxidectin directable, like the injectable. There are some products that have it contained, but there's no trade name for like the pure IV injectable, and that's what we would use in this case for solubility reasons. But like Credelio Quattro has it, but again, now we're mixing a whole bunch of other drugs, and now we're in that interceptor problem. So you'd have to just get like the pure drug compounded. And again, it's actually like a 500 ml bottle is only like $200, and it's quite concentrated as well. So that's generally enough to treat a large volume of water. Again, we're still testing it, so it doesn't mean that if you put it in your tank and it explodes, it's not my fault. But it's something that we are testing.
Hey, Alex, I asked Kevin this question in terms of, the different bugs, parasitic copapods that are out there. We talked about red bugs, white bugs, and black bugs. And, Kevin mentioned that black bugs were certainly very more stubborn and tougher to get rid of. But are you guys, Polo Reef, and your experience with other, reef tanks around, just using interceptor and just doing it, on a frequency basis to break that life cycle?
So combination of both. I believe the dose for milbemycin oxamine is quite large. There was one paper that was put out by Christy Barton, where they showed that the toxic levels to copapods was anywhere from like micrograms to milligrams. So we have 1,000-fold dose range. Where you can use as little, I think it was like 0.367 micrograms per liter was effective for some species, whereas some species it was like 0.325 milligrams per liter per milligram per liter. So I think it's just finding the right dose. A lot of the times it's been, I think traditionally the dose has been 23 milligrams per 400 gallons. I'm not saying to do it, but I've done 3-4 times the dose range in some instances and not seen issues. So I think it's finding the right dose range. Again, there's a certain point where we're going to have therapeutic concentration. It's just, is it going to kill the corals that we're working with? And again, some corals are most likely more susceptible to medication than others, some are more fragile. So it's playing with how high can I push this dose range without damaging the coral. I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of those data points, but I think it's just finding the right dose. And again, sometimes even increasing the frequency. We don't know how fast it breaks down in the water column. Certain drugs break down within hours. So there's no reason to think that this may not be the case. It doesn't appear to have any residual activity. So even dosing, bi-weekly, I don't think is unreasonable. I think it's always reasonable to treat tanks and be aggressive about it, as long as we know that there's potential side effects, that we can wipe out a system by making a wrong calculation. But at the same time, certain cases we have to make those aggressive plays, otherwise we're not going to get anywhere.
So how much damaging they do if you don't do that? It just so are those that really can wipe out your whole tank or just slow the coral growth?
So
yeah,
because there's definitely going to be
it's always a benefit, a balance there, right?
Yeah,
so
a lot of the corals
line.
will just slow down and irritate. They don't necessarily just kill things per se. So, they could sort of linger in the system. And some people will just go the control method where they'll try to knock it back periodically and that sort of thing. So, it's not going to wipe it out. Things like the black bug ciliates, those can just nuke and destroy corals rapidly. But a lot of the things like red bugs, you'll notice that decreased polyp extension, over time, just slowed growth rates. Color won't be as good, that sort of thing. And eventually the numbers will get so high that they'll spread throughout the system and cause more significant damage. And at that point, it's not the best thing to have in a system. But I have seen thriving reefs that do have pests present. But it just depends on how you want to go about that. Is that the goal, especially for collectors? And then at that point, if you're sharing pieces with other friends and things like that in the hobby, you have to be conscious of what you could be spreading around as well. So being that is something that could be treated on intake or on quarantine as a standard practice, that would be the best way to go about it. Or at least if you're aware of it, treat it in the system. Now you would have to, eliminate all your invertebrates with the exoskeleton, like your hermits and your shrimp and all those critters as best you could. It would nuke all the rest of the pods in the system. So it would be a little bit of a shock to the system, but you can hit a whole tank with that more effectively than you could if you got acrid-eating flatworms or something like that in there.
Yeah, because I watch a live stream from Tidal Garden. Sen, if I pronounce it correctly, he mentioned that using potassium chloride to knock off the ciliates because the coral slime, and then everybody just gets sloshed off by exposing the coral from potassium chloride. So provided that you can take every single coral out of your tank and dip them individually, actually that's what I'm doing, because all my corals I can remove individual colony. Then none of them is locked onto the rock. They just sit there. So by taking the whole colony, basically I spend most of my day dipping coral. Just potassium chloride going through the whole system, one tank after another.
And that's acro eating flatworms who you're talking about.
No, everything just slosh off. And
so even parasitic copapods, you're if you got any bugs on there, they're
they're all sort of things. Everybody die, everybody fall off, especially when the coral slime, like SPS, they slime off, they just slosh off, and then you end up with a very clean piece of thing. Despite that, the potassium chloride may not get you kill the bug, but they get washed off.
Yeah, are you trying to treat acro-eating flatworms or anything specific in that tank?
No, just a preventive maintenance. Just go through dip anyway.
Yeah, I would say it'd be a better route to, again, hit it hard and very disciplined before it ever goes into the system. Because at that point, you're not going to have to devote all that manpower and put the corals through all that additional stress and, upset the balance of your reef tank. So a lot of times, like let's say you even did get acro flatworms in your main display, I would recommend to most people to pull out every last bit of acropora from that system, scour the rocks, make sure there's no residual encrustment or, branches that fell off in the back of the tank or in between the rock work, and let it, go fallow. So at that point, even if you're pulling out the coral colonies, there could still be some stuff lingering in there that may continue that cycle. So if you were to move them into a separate system where you could, during that process, remove them, inspect for eggs, cut off eggs, then dip, and then continue to do those inspections, and then do probably another transfer. But the key to that is to making sure you're not transferring eggs at that point. Then you can wait it out in your display tank to where that all those little critters in there that might have left and are searching for food, trying to find any kind of food source to continue their life, they're just going to starve out. And at that point, die. And then you can move things back once you're assured that they're clean at that point.
I think that one thing that's quite different for me is that because I don't bring in new corals, I don't bring in wild corals, and mostly this thing just growing inside the tank, and I acquire all the other corals from people that I know that already have the tank. Then there is quite extensive dipping, cutting before they actually entering the grow out system. So actually, just because of the all this bug that you guys mentioned, that is the reason I cut off the wild import route, the wholesaler route, and all that kind of thing. So that definitely reduce a lot of.
The copapods are much easier to treat in your large aquarium, though. So that would be one of those ones I would say it would not be worth dipping everything in the display tank constantly like that to eliminate that. That's just a lot of extra work. And if you haven't seen any signs of nudibranchs or flatworms or anything like that, I would wait until you do. At that point,
that would be too late.
Especially if you're bringing in very little. That's where if you have a clean system and you've been disciplined and you're having a small stream of items come in, just put in that time, really think out a proper process, or be sure that the source you're buying it from and puts in that work, so you can be very confident. That being said, I would still probably, even if you were buying from me, recommend visually inspecting it, looking it over,
of course, yeah.
And dipping it. I know some vendors out there tell you to just put the stuff right in the tank and
No.
wait
Bad idea.
dip it
That's
later.
bad idea.
I just think that's a ticking time bomb.
Trust nobody.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
if my mom,
nobody.
if my mom was going to sell me a coral, I would still dip it in quarantine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some of my guys think I'm crazy. I'm buying, Angry Birds frags that are these little itty bitty things. They're like, oh man, don't worry about it. Let's just, get that one through there. And no, it has to go through that process. It has to go through those multiple dips, transfers, going through. Yeah. It's probably going to lose some color and be stressed. I might lose some, but at the end of the day, it's protecting what we've built and providing that to our customers, and not spreading those things around that could ruin somebody's collection. And, we're very conscious of that.
I'll just throw in something that I've done in the past. I have a 20-gallon tank that I right now it's dry because I haven't brought any corals in a long time, but it's my coral quarantine tank, and so I'll basically I could set it up within a matter of like an hour or two. And so, when I want to set it up to bring in some corals that I'm bringing in from the outside, I'll just take some established tank water from one of my systems. I've got, some live rock that, I used to have a cryptic sump. Now I don't have that cryptic sump anymore that had the live rock, but I could soak some live rock in one of my sumps, and, in anticipation of that. And so, basically I take established tank water, put some live rock from one of my systems into that quarantine tank. I've got a light, I've got a power head, a heater, and a hang on the back filter that one of those sponge filters with a little filter sponge on it, a little activated carbon as well in the back of that thing. And so I'll bring some stuff in. I'll dip it in potassium chloride. Initially, I'll hit the tank with the Interceptor chews, twice during a 4-week period. I'll do weekly KCl dips. So that's kind of like my protocol. The coral, I'm talking about Aquapora. That's kind of like what I use for Aquapora. And my acro frags that I put into that through that process do lose color. And it gets a little nerve-wracking, especially if you bring in some higher-end pieces. But for the most part, like 90% of the stuff that I put through that quarantine system come out on the other side and eventually color back up and look good. So, that's kind of like an easy way for a hobbyist to set up a coral quarantine system. Not that expensive, and just takes a little bit of effort to do that. And I know, Alex, the same could be said about a fish quarantine tank, right? It's not that hard to do.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I want to jump along with what Kevin was saying about like inspection of new pieces is most critical point, right? Once we've already added something with disease, right, that's a whole different ball game than addressing it initially. What I like to do in terms of like initial inspection is not relying on the dips themselves, but relying on actually like visual identification of the problems that we're dealing with. I tend to like to use like a stereo microscope or a dissecting microscope. They're relatively inexpensive. Inexpensive is a relative term, but when people are buying expensive Aquapora, investing in a somewhat cheap stereo microscope or dissecting microscope can be really beneficial. And what I do with those types of scopes is they look at the surface rather than like a light microscope that shines light through the sample, and you look essentially on a molecular level. A stereo microscope is like 10x, 15x. So it just makes visual identification of red bugs or any of those parasitic copapods, flatworms, etc., more obvious. And what I do on top of that is I take like an iPhone and actually run a time lapse of the coral underwater, like in a little dish for like 10 or so minutes. Sometimes again, these flatworms are super small. They're not really moving too much. I see people that look at a coral, turn around once or twice and say it's clean. No, that's not clean, right? So we have to be 100% sure that it's not clean before we put it in our tanks. So when we take these time lapses, now I get 10 minutes of any subtle movement on that coral, is exaggerated extremely. Again, even if it moves a millimeter on a time lapse, it's bouncing back and forth, and it makes identification of anything abnormal in the tissue a lot easier. And again, it's a relatively inexpensive thing for hobbyists to be doing at home, and I think it makes diagnostic power substantially higher. Again, we're no longer just looking at a tank, I've seen people go, oh, I don't have flatworms, and they're looking through their tank 6 inches at a coral under blue light, and there's no way to identify those flatworms by doing that, right? So if we pull it out and then we take that sample under the stereo microscope and then run that time lapse, we can actually see those little individual flatworms moving around, and it makes identification a lot easier. Once we've identified our problem, then moving forward with it and coming up with a treatment protocol is a lot easier than treating the system itself.
Hey, I just want to take a time out here because I screwed up at the beginning and I forgot to thank our sponsors. So we're gonna take a 30-second time here to thank the sponsors. Polo Reef, I mentioned Polo Reef, and Alex, you do some work for Andrew Sandler and the crew at Polo Reef. They are a sponsor of this live stream. I want to thank them very much. So they check out their latest video on their the YouTube channel. The specifics of the video. I know I saw Andrew in the chat. Andrew, just throw in the chat what you guys got going on in terms of the latest YouTube video, and we could talk about it. The other sponsor is Champion Lighting and Supply. Flow is very important for keeping corals happy in a reef. Growing corals can block flow from wave makers and create dead spots. That's about to change. The ocean sea wave will oscillate any wave maker or power head in your aquarium from 0 to 180 degrees at an adjustable speed. This creates natural dynamic flow patterns, reduces dead spots, and kicks up detritus. The ocean sea wave is available exclusively through Champion Lighting and Supply. Visit championlighting.com for more information. Okay. So that was like, Monty Python fans. Now for something completely different. That was but the sponsors of this show are very important. So I apologize that I didn't get that in the beginning. But all right, back to the discussion. So I've seen a couple of comments, and I wanted to put this comment up by Amanda Meckley. What's happening there, Amanda? She's asking a question about black bug ciliates. Are they the ones that normally start eating the edges of the coral or new growth? And this kind of ties into what I wanted to ask you guys about in terms of trying to identify what's going on with certain pests visually. What are some telltale signs? Oh, can't hear you, Alex. Lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Yep.
Beautiful. So I think it's really important to clarify, right? So black bugs would entail parasitic copapods, where ciliates are protozoal organisms. So yes, there are protozoal organisms that look like black bugs or smaller black bugs. So I think it's really defining, is this a ciliate protozoal type problem, or is this a parasitic copepod type problem? And then I think those are both treated and handled very differently.
Gotcha. So the other part of that question to you guys, both Kevin and Alex, what are some of the telltale signs for identifying pests? I mean, some of the things that I've seen is like reduced polyp extension on acros. Maybe there's, you could potentially see some bite marks, obviously, for aquating flatworms, but maybe some pale colorations. Do you guys have any, things that folks should be looking out for in terms of, oh yeah, that would be an obvious sign of a pest?
So in terms for me, you go first, Kevin.
Yeah, I was saying you touched on a lot of them. But general stress on the coral, maybe irregular growth, things like that. Yes, in general, though, a lot of times you could even have these pests on corals that appear perfectly healthy. So really, it's important to not take that for granted either. A lot of times you want to look in the nooks and crannies and underneath in the areas that these creatures have evolved to survive predators in the wild. So, typically they're going to be in the hidden areas and tend to thrive in those spots. So usually you're not going to see them right up on top. A lot of times they'll be underneath. Like if you have a Montipora with multiple layers and folds, you might at first glance see the growth edges being perfectly healthy. But then when you really get in there with a scope or specs and look under the ridges, you might see some spots where it's receding, and then potentially see some of those Monteportian nudibranchs hiding under there, even eggs, that sort of thing. Which, from my perspective, I don't envy you, Alex, because I know you guys have to deal with a lot of very large pieces, and it's difficult to see through every inch of those things. So, for us, we typically break down the colonies to more manageable sizes so we can really see everywhere on it as well. Even on acros, sometimes you'll have one part that looks very healthy, but then if you look deep down in there, that's where you could find some pests and dead spots, and you'll see maybe some algae and that kind of stuff settling, where there could be eggs, stuff like that might be hiding in those areas too.
I'm a big believer that more people have aquapore flats and money nudibranchs, etc., that acknowledge that they have them. Unfortunately, I think me early in my career, and I think everyone else, we all suffer from reefer denial, and that we think that our tanks are perfectly, again, that, we don't have, aquapore flats. And I think that unfortunately that there's like a stigma in the hobby, like, my corals are clean versus not. And I think a lot of death is attributed to pests. And I think a lot of people go, it's a bacterial infection, and they jump to bacteria immediately without checking for pests. And the thing is, pests are very easily identifiable if you're looking for them. And I think a lot of people aren't looking for them. I think a lot of people go, I bought this from a reputable person, there's no way it has pests. Or they just themselves don't want to acknowledge that there's pests. And we all, people who've been in the hobby for a while, you look at a coral and you can look at something's not right. And what's always, again, what I see and what I commonly went through myself as a hobbyist was, you're like, it's a bad day. Like it's going to open up better tomorrow. And once you get past the something's wrong and you have to acknowledge that something's wrong, that's way more beneficial than like, tomorrow it'll be okay. Like, a hermit crab fell on the affiliate today and that's why it's closed. And then tomorrow it's still closed. And you're like, something else. And we keep creating excuses rather than pulling out that coral and having the fear that there may be, Euphyllia flatworms on that coral. So I think for, hobbyists who've been in it for a decent amount of time, you can look at a coral and go, something's not right, right? And it's best to not just assume, it's the water chemistry, it's the lighting today. Pull it out and actually look through that coral quite extensively, right? When we have Euphyllia flatworms or something of that nature, those flatworms are within the coral polyp. So when you pull it out of the water, again, everything's going to close up, and now they're within the polyp itself. And you look on the outside, and you're like, it's clean, right? And you don't want to do like a deep dig. If you take like fresh water and like a syringe, you kind of flush out that polyp. Sometimes you can flush out some of those Euphyllia flats. And at the same time, what I like to do is I'll put it under the triacular microscope, set it for that time lapse, because some of the Euphyllia flats we've seen are incredibly small, like a couple millimeters, and they're also quite translucent. So they almost look like the flesh of the coral itself. So you put some fresh water, RDI water, on top or in that coral polyp cup and let it sit for a couple minutes and see if those flatworms start to emerge, right? So I think once we notice something's wrong and we didn't see a hermit crab fall on it, we can no longer convince ourselves that something's natural is happening. And when we acknowledge that there's actually a problem and actually looking for them, and I think that's a big thing that a lot of people could be doing at home.
Alex, I got a question for you. Is that interceptor is hard to get, but there's a flatworm exit is readily available. Why that thing doesn't do as much as interceptor?
So interceptor generally doesn't.
Yeah.
So interceptor doesn't generally treat flatworms. Yes, there's praziquantel in it, but the dose of praziquantel isn't therapeutic for any flatworm variety that I've seen. That being said, flatworm exit, I believe, is a proprietary ingredient, so they don't tell you exactly what's in it, so we can't work backwards and figure out the mechanism of action. Anecdotally, I've seen...
sorry. The flatworm exit is the pig dewormer. It is...
So flatworm exit is not levitismol. It's a proprietary ingredient and they have their own blend, but because it's proprietary, you can't find out what's in it. Because if it was levitismol, then they'd have to have labeling and that would have to be on the label itself, which it's not. And levitismol can be used in other instances, but in the case of flatworm exit, I've seen it work sometimes anecdotally, but I don't think it's something to rely on. It is sometimes a viable first choice, but I've run it at like 3-4 times the therapeutic concentration and still sometimes haven't had results. Some people have come to me swearing by it, but in terms of like actual data and literature, there's something that shows that it's actually viable. until someone or the company themselves say what the actual ingredient is, can we even work backwards to see if the mechanism of action could even kill flatworms other than just irritate them? But again, that's still up in the air.
I think that the flatworm exit ingredient is known, even though that I don't know why they don't put on their label. Maybe in Holland they don't have to.
No, I think they may have changed the formula years back, and most people are using that for planaria currently, not the acropore-eating flatworms. And the concentrations typically of flatworm exit that you have to run are extremely high to be lethal for most pests. And at least when we've done experiments, even using that, it's been very stressful on certain corals too. And there's a lot better options out there. So there's not really a good in-tank full treatment for acro-eating flatworms out there currently, unfortunately.
So there's been a lot of talk in the chat here about fenbendazole, the Angel plus food flake. Yeah.
So my one question with the fenbendazole is, yes, it's a phenomenal antihelminthic, something that we use across a lot of species, generally safe in most species, is why the flakes? Why are we not just adding it directly? And I know someone came up with, oh, maybe the coral's consuming the flake and the flakes are now getting, within the system of the coral. But generally, like the moment you put fenbendazole and flakes in the water, it's going to start to dissolve out of the water, right? So my question is, why are we not just dosing the fenbendazole directly, right? And that's something that we're actually experimenting with at Polo moving forward.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. That is something we were theorizing as well, that maybe micro-dosing fenbendazole is a more effective way, though some people do think that the actual corals are getting it and ingesting it and helping aid to resist these pests. So it's not really definitive out there as far as any studies that I know of either way. I think more and more people will just have to try it out. And it's an excellent way to possibly start to control this if you do have the problem in the tank. Whether or not it'll eliminate that 100%, that's something we'll have to see long-term there. Unfortunately, I haven't seen acro-eating flatworms in a little while, so we haven't had to run some experiments on them with the fenbendazole. We were treating some other stuff that we were kicking around.
So is fenbendazole actually work on acro-eating flatworm? Is that what?
Well, in terms, I just want to jump back to what he was saying in terms of like microdosing. In terms of like parasitic management, we always want to do the highest dose with the least effects, right? Because if we start doing microdosing and we only essentially start killing the weak population, let's say we have 100 flatworms in a tank, we microdose and we only kill 25. Let's say we kill 50. So then it's no longer clinical. Our acros look fine. They're still there. There's still 50 flatworms. Over time, we're going to select for a population that was resistant to the fenbendazole. So when we treat for parasitic agents, we want to make sure we wipe out the entire population. So that's finding the highest dose that no longer causes clinical signs and that doesn't affect the animal that we're treating.
That's an excellent point. And I guess I misspoke. Microdosing wouldn't exactly be the word. I would say just not the standard dose that people have traditionally used to treat the pest clove polyps and things like that. That tends to be extremely stressful on most other corals. Like I've had customers and people I've known nuke their acros trying to eliminate some of those nuisance blue clove polyps and things like that. That dosage is just very extreme. So yeah, finding the proper dosage that's significantly less that would be lethal for the specific pest. You're absolutely right there.
So do you guys think that fenben is that potentially we're onto something here in terms of full in-tank treatment for acro-eating flatworms? I mean, it sounds to me like it's something that you've got to continually dose, over a long period of time. So I kind of wonder. Go ahead, Alex.
So dosing for a long period of time now, again, is there accumulation within the rock? Is there accumulation of drug? Again, there's no way for us without like mass spec for us to know how much concentration of the drug is present in the water column. Theoretically, there was only one paper that described acropore flatworm life cycles, and they only talked about one species, and it was like a 28-day life cycle. So if we go, let's be like really cautious and like really paranoid and like double that life cycle, like we should if we don't add any more acros, the treatment should be able to clear all viable offspring within, their, 58 days or a little bit less. So I'm hoping that it's not like a long-term thing, because again, now we're essentially predisposing to resistance if we're not getting rid of the problem. If they're hatching and they're not immediately dying, now we're just selecting for a stronger population. So hopefully it's, like a pulsatile treatment. If we get or describe the life cycle a little bit better, and we go, okay, at this temperature, we have this colony, and we know we started on day X, and then day X we treat, and then we wait based on temperature. When do we treat again? Yes, they may not all lay eggs at the same time, but by the second treatment, everything should kind of synchronize up. And the ones that are hatching should be hatching at the same time. Again, the first initial, you're going to have different, juvenile populations hatching at different times. But if we start treating in like a pulsatile fashion, we'll have, again, on day one, we know we're expecting them to hatch. If they all hatch at this temperature and temperature's been consistent, we know to treat the day after. So then now we start killing them as they're born, rather than prolonging treatment and treating, every day for 14 days. Let's say, hatching is 16 days. We start treating once every 16 days at that new generation, rather than sensitizing and stressing out the tank as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I'm showing a comment here from Chris Meckley. He said he stopped using the flake, and 6 months later, he had a colony with tight growth, show signs, and sure enough, they were on it. The flake had made my job much easier. I guess the question, Chris, is were there new corals added to that system that potentially could have come in there, or are you saying that that was a system that had no new corals come in, and then 6 months later, you saw the aquaculture flatworms again after you stopped the flake? I mean, you mentioned Alex, in terms of the life cycle for the aquaculture flatworms. I mean, I had them once, and I basically dipped every coral in my system in KCL once a week for 3 months, and I didn't add any new corals, and that did it. That broke the life cycle. They were done. So go ahead, Dong.
Oh, Alex. Is it known that what kind of mechanism of action of fenbendazole that work on aqua-eating flatworm, and what enzyme they're targeting, and what's the pathway? Is that known for fenbendazole?
For other flatworm, as an antihelminthic, yes, it's like a paralytic. For flatworms particularly, no. So no one's paid a lot of money to study the exact pathway in flatworms. Again, as an antihelminthic, essentially it's a receptor blocker that blocks essentially like movement as per se. But
you basically made them paralyzed, right?
In a sense, for specifically in acroflats, no, there's no research or funding that. But again, if we look at other, planarial type organisms or like fluke type organisms, flatworms in, a dog or a cat, yes, there is some literature regarding that. And again,
so
the hope
because
is
there's some
translational medicine.
So because there's some pathway is very difficult to bypass by certain species, so the resistance actually can be pretty low. But some pathway is easy to get around. So then you end up, if you don't kill them all, then just like the bacterial, the resistance that's showing up. So it highly depends on what exactly is the pathway that the drug actually killing the bug.
Yeah.
So
the thing is, well, bacteria and helminths are going to be like two different classes because the generational time between is substantially different, right? So the speed at which acropora flatworms are essentially evolving and changing is way different than like a bacterial population. Certain bacterial populations, we can have 100 generations in a couple hours, whereas you're not having, you may have 1 or 2 generations of flatworms a month. So the speed at which resistance is going to develop is significantly slower.
Yes. So that means that maybe for home hobbyist, the microdosing method maybe actually is pretty easy and achievable. So
when you say microdosing, you
actually
mean
underdosing.
but if we're underdosing, now we're causing potential side effects at a lower level, and we're not treating the problem. Right, the goal of parasitic management is to get rid of the parasite. It's not to manage it long term, right? So again, we have any of these corals. Again, you've got flatworms. The goal is not, we got to dip, once a week for 3 months. Like that's a lot of intensive work. The goal is to have, a strict treatment protocol X time and have that essentially be 100% successful, right? We don't want long term management because the thing is, it really comes down to replicatable is it, right? If I dunked my acros every week for 3 months and I missed a couple eggs because I wasn't as diligent as Keith, that's not a reputable, reliable, protocol, right? So we're trying to reduce like that human error and reduce how much do I have to stare at this coral until I'm 100% confident, right? If we know if we put X drug in at X interval, we know by Y time that there are going to be no survivors. So I think that's where it needs to head rather than manual removal.
So I think the potassium chloride that with a colony, like Kevin said, to chop it, well, don't keep it too big. And then basically it's more like a physical removal of anything off the coral. And especially if you chop the base off, only get the branches, and then when you get a big colony, you chop it up. So then you can look at it under the magnifying glass, and basically you can see most of them.
Especially on SPS, definitely.
Yeah, so I think that probably is a more doable management way for a home hobbyist. So you just grab the whole thing and don't lock them down. So grab the whole thing, just dip it in potassium chloride. I mean, lime like crazy.
Basically, you're going to have to take, if you got an established reef tank, display tank, you're going to have to kind of tear it down a little bit. And
actually,
you're very much an expert, Dong, in terms of being able to kind of like take a mature system and dip every colony in there, because your methodology in terms of the mounting of the corals is you can pull out any coral you want. So it's really, but you're an exception. I mean, there's not many people that. I mean, I'm old school. I've got stuff that's like encrusted on the rocks and glued to the rocks, and for somebody like me that's got an established tank that's got a lot of encrusted acros, you're gonna have to kind of like bite the bullet. And that nice display tank is not going to look great when you're going to be taking out every coral to treat it. But I guess what you got to do is you got to kind of like look at the long term, and eradication of the pests is the primary objective. And then once that happens, after a few months or a couple of months, whatever it is, then things get back into hopefully that good groove.
So how about make the aquascape or removable, modular? So
yeah,
I agree with that as like a management, but like aesthetically, is it as pleasing as the corals being on the rocks? And that's where it's like
that's very true.
How easy do you want to make your life, and how aesthetically pleasing do you want it to be? Because at the end of the day, like, as much as this is a science, there's like an artistic approach to it. And we all have our different styles. And again, I personally don't like to see, like, I think management, like with PVC pipes and the corals in, pull them out, clean them, is the best strategy for management purposes. But aesthetically, like, I want my home tank to look as natural as possible. And now we run into this thing is the natural is just making your life more difficult. So it's balancing this aesthetic versus how manageable do I want my tank to be.
So that tank is modular. I can take out any piece of coral, every single piece, and then dip them and put them back. Well, actually,
it looks good. It looks good.
It's doable for sure, but it takes a lot of planning. And to that point, I would say anyone who's going through that level of planning, it would be easier to plan the protocol to bring the corals in initially to avoid those pests getting in there, just so you won't have to tear the tank apart as much and that sort of thing. But there are ways of making modular too, so you could plan ahead and make that part of your scape as well, just in case.
Hey, so I got a question for you guys. Fenbendazole, collateral damage. Should we be concerned about that? Because you're nuking pretty much, any type of tube worm. The flatworms, I guess, are getting it. But I've got like a lot of different feather dusters and I guess people use Fenben for the vermitid snails too, because there can be quite irritating to corals in terms of throwing out their webs. So I think people are using fenbendazole for both the aqua-eating flatworms and vermitid snails. But should we be concerned about the collateral damage? It always seems like when you're treating something in a reef tank, there is going to be some sort of domino effect. And, how concerned should we be about those dominoes falling on something else?
there seems to be a big residual effect for like soft tissue corals, softies in general. I've seen, again, it's always hard to pinpoint things directly, but I've seen tanks where we've used fenbendazole and the rock can absorb fenbendazole to a degree. And if you take that rock and you put that in a tank with certain softies, it tends to leach out and you can actually kill softies in a tank with rock that was initially treated. So again, there's definitely high risk if you have softies. Again, there may be some risk with the acros, but again, there is massive residual effects. And it appears that even if you wash the rock, there is still some fenbendazole, again, if it's depending if it's binding to the outside of the rock, or if it's going within the rock, if it's porous. But we've seen many cases of moving the rock and it still kills certain types of softies.
Yeah, actually, there's one example. There's a guy actually I know that he bought a used tank, so also as well as a rock on in there. No matter what, he cannot keep any soft coral, and he loves soft coral. And I said, well, ask the seller if he actually ever treated the tank with fenbendazole. Then he asked, yeah, that's what happened. So
Wow.
yeah, he cannot keep soft coral. So,
Because the rock has it.
Yeah, because the rock has it, and you stay there for a long time.
And which species have you seen affected the most? I mean, mostly the clove polyps and things like that.
Polyp and toadstool.
Star polyps, possibly.
Cinularia.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Even the leathers too. Huh?
Yeah, the finger leather, they all get affected. It's like
we've had some of the hitchhiking nuisance ones pop up in between some of the zoas that we had brought in. And we had done some spot treatments at higher doses to eliminate those. And zoas seem to bounce back. It stresses them out, but they seem like they can handle it fairly well. But we never really had the need to treat a whole system with that stuff in the farm. So I hadn't really seen that firsthand. So that's interesting to hear.
Yeah. It's very long-lasting effect. Really drive that guy crazy.
Even xenia and stuff like that.
Oh, every soft coral that he wanted to give is all dead.
Really?
So he was thinking about heavy metal poisoning. He's thinking about he checked all his equipment. He's thinking that his heater is broken, but nothing. And for matter of fact, I gave him some SPS, and the SPS does pretty well. Then I said, well, ask the seller that where you bought that thing from. That does he actually treat the tank with fenbendazole? Yeah. Oh, yeah. It turned out to be the case to kill off crow polyps.
More reason to have multiple tanks, right?
There you go.
Absolutely. Not linked together though.
Yes, true.
So, so Kevin, you provided a bunch of different pictures, and we did show the white cross bug parasitic. Was that a parasitic copepod?
Yeah, that was the one that we encountered that was preying on a wide range of different species. That was quite concerning that we've been seeing more and more coming in.
I'd like to show the rest of your pictures here and also kind of get Alex's take on this stuff. Let's start with this. What is this called? An alvea pora eating nudibranch with egg clusters. So nudibranchs. Those are tough to get rid of, correct?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah. So gastropods tend to be incredibly difficult, right? The only known like chemicals are like, like snail killers type thing, which is super toxic to coral. We've actually been playing with like hypersalinity just to see how far we can push them. And we've gotten extreme salinity in some cases, and they stop moving and we think that they're dead. And the moment they're rehydrated, they come back alive. In terms of like alveopora nudibranchs, it's something that we've actually seen like more commonly within like the past year or so. And I've never seen a white one, but I've seen some pink ones. And I'm a big believer of that there's going to be multiple parasites for every coral that we see. So for everything, every genre or genus of coral, there's going to be a specific parasite that looks incredibly like the coral that is infecting. So yeah, in this case, it's a white or greenish alveopora with a white greenish nudibranch. And again, when they're within the polyps themselves, it's going to be incredibly hard to see them.
So do they eat Garni or alveopora only?
Just alves.
Really?
Just alves. Huh.
That's very specific.
Most of the nudibranchs are very specific. So that's, zoanthid, nudies. I mean, there are some soft coral eating nudibranchs that will eat little more variety that we've come upon. But the good thing about a lot of them is most of the dips are pretty effective for knocking them off, and a lot of times the eggs are a little easier to spot too. So if you're not dealing with a lot of large colonies and they're not in the display, treating them outside is at least when we ran them through the batches, fairly easy to remove and cut out after a few rounds of dips and manual removal of eggs. We don't see it that often, but I would say I think it was mostly the ones coming in from Australia, I believe, is where we found these on a couple different shipments in the last year. It was just something different that you don't see as often.
In terms of dips, for Alveopora and Goniopora, what do you guys like? I mean, I'll relate something in terms of my own experience. I had these Aceola flatworms. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. That were infesting both my Gonies and I believe my Alveopora. They were just on those corals. They were not on anything else. And I tried some standard dips, some Coral RX, I think, and what would happen is the polyps would retract into the skeleton, and the flatworm would go with those polyps into the skeleton and kind of be protected from the dip. But when I used KCl, potassium chloride, that completely got rid of all the flatworms, all of those flatworms. Every algae and every Goni that I dipped, they just could not survive the KCl, and I guess it was because of all of the water being kind of sucked out of the flatworm that kind of like imploded. So what would be a good dip if you're bringing in algae and Gonis to really just eliminate any potential pests, including the nudibranchs?
The potassium you mentioned is definitely really solid. Reef Primer has a little extra, something I'm not quite sure exactly what's in it, but we noticed that they would disintegrate a little bit faster, and it was slightly more effective than just the potassium. But that's what we usually use on that.
You mean the Polyp Labs Reef Primer?
Yeah.
I think they probably have two different type, or at least two different type of potassium salt. I may be wrong, but that's what was somebody told me. And just besides potassium chloride, they have potassium something else.
Yeah, maybe some oxidizer. We're not 100% sure on that, but it does seem to have a little bit different effect. But the potassium chloride by itself is still fairly effective, but we have noticed sometimes the Polyp Lab product being a little better for the nudies.
Have you tried potassium nitrate?
For coral dips? No, I haven't.
Yeah.
No.
Does it work?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's Well, the reason I'm asking is that actually there's a guy actually he's dipping the coral with potassium. Actually, instead of buying potassium chloride, he actually bought the potassium nitrate, and it sounds like it's as effective as the potassium chloride.
Chris from ACI is saying iodine is the best dip in his opinion.
I think anything that's irritating is a dip, right? So I don't think a lot of them are going to treat, but again, in certain instances, I use Melaflix. Do I think it treats anything? No. Do I think it's really irritating and obnoxious to some of the corals and some of the parasites so I can see them? Because again, I just use dips for identification purposes. I don't use dips for treatment or management purposes. So again, anything, even if it's Revive, something that just causes irritation so that you can see the movement or you see them jump off the coral. So I think, most dips are okay as long as it's causing irritation to the parasite and not to the coral themselves. I actually have another video of a Alveopora nudie, and it just looks incredibly different. And I just want to show like how different some of these organisms can be depending on what the coral that they're infecting looks like.
We're going to try to get you to share this. You want to share your screen?
Yeah.
Right. And like he mentioned, as far as them being irritators too, it's very important when you're treating these things in the dips to a lot of times use a turkey baster, or we usually have a power head going in our dip bin to just kind of flush things and, you know, help aid in knocking things off the corals as well. So usually we'll go in with the baster, try to get in all the nooks and crannies during that whole process, and then shake them off vigorously before they get transferred into the rinse too.
So what concentration of potassium chloride are you using, Kevin?
The exact concentration, I think it was you know what? I think it was a teaspoon per gallon. Or tablespoon. I have all these things written down on a chart. We have pre-measured, so honestly, I'm not the best at. You know, I take it for granted. Literally, oh, here's a pre-measured scoop. Boom, throw it in with the bin and the line already marked. I'll catch up with you after though in the comments or something just to verify. Yeah. But it's kind of the standard dose that's out there.
Alex, I'm trying to like figure out a way how I could get you to share your screen here. So hang on. You got to Dong, ask a couple of questions while I figure this out.
Oh, okay. Hey, actually, after looking at these photos, actually reminds me of the movie Alien. Pretty scary.
Oh, you know what reminds me of the movie Alien? The Zoa spiders. Now those things.
Oh my goodness.
The face huggers.
The face hugger. Yeah.
Oh, those
that coral hugger.
All right, let's talk about those then. The Zoa spiders, man. What is going on with that?
Those things are the worst.
Talk to us.
Fortunately, they are not hermaphroditic, and they reproduce through sexual reproduction. So if you start killing them, it's not like they split through binary fission. So having a large population of them is a lot more manageable than like flatworms. Mm-hmm. And they tend to bail from the coral pretty easily with pretty much any dip. I haven't seen them cause too much problem. I've only seen a couple of instances where there's like several hundred on a rock, but that's incredibly rare and exciting.
You know, it's bizarre, but so the zoanthid spiders, I hate to say it, but almost all the wild, big, beautiful rocks that are coming in our experience, seem to have them on there, to the point where we've mostly just steered completely clear of even dealing with those things, and mostly just buying from aquacultured sources and from frags to grow our colonies from where they're very manageable. In my experience, at least on those, they're a little more resilient. We've even had instances where we were dipping them and we thought they were clean and you wouldn't see anything. But we theorize that they can hide inside the polyps, that they can burrow under the polyps. If you have a lot of the rocks and substrate that's attached to the bases of those pieces when they're being imported, they can find refuge in there as well. So, and most dips aren't lethal for them. That's the biggest thing is knocking them off is difficult, and they tend to latch on.
Have you tried?
So they've been a little tougher. The milbemycin didn't work effectively, even in really high
what dose
doses.
you used?
I think we went up even to 10 times the standard.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it wasn't really effective. There are dips that you can do where you would run a duration, where you would repetitively treat the tank to the point where they can't molt. And that can be effective for eliminating those, but it's also incredibly stressful on the zoas. So that's something we'll have to do a little bit more experimentation on, to where we feel it's 100%. Because again, the way we're doing it, we have so many of these zoanthids. For us, it's just much easier to break them all down into itty bitty frags where there's not really any place they can be hiding. But there are a lot of those really nice zoas that are getting imported. But yeah, I mean, I would say 9 out of 10 times we see them. Nudies, zoa nudies, spiders on them. And, you know, again, they come in, they look healthy as can be. And you're thinking, oh, well, these things will probably be fine. Then you start digging a little deeper. And, you know, just in the wild, there's so much natural predation. I think they don't have a chance to really get in there and do work compared to what might happen once you get them in the tank.
Remy, thank you so much for that super chat, man. Good to see you in the chat there. Alex, there's a plus button at the bottom of your screen there. If you click on that plus button, it's going to say share screen. And if you do that, I should see it and allow you to. Let me know if you get that.
I have to change some settings.
At the bottom is
So
a few icons.
Oh, and I
they're
have
right
to
next to
quit
the
browser
microphone.
and restart it because I had to change my system settings.
Oh.
I could send it to you.
Okay.
And take it from there.
Yeah, I could see if I can get it on there.
Yeah, so I think that definitely that for the zoanthus, because they're such a fast-growing zoanthus, and also there are really not that many new things coming into the hobby. So I think aquaculture definitely is the way to go. Instead of buying from the rocks, wrap in wet newspaper, import from Vietnam, those kind of pests is nightmare. I probably about 5, 6, 7 many years ago, I deal with one shipment. Oh my God. And then basically those things just infested with all sorts of the nudibranch, spiders, wrapped in wet newspaper. Oh my God, that's a nightmare to deal with. So no more. But good thing is that I put them into the QT system, not connected. Then I'm dealing with the whole for a long time, looking at this piece of crap and keep having this. I just toss the whole thing away. So no more.
What about natural?
It's not worth it.
What about natural predators? EIY Kumar don't wrasses eat the spiders.
Probably not that effective. Right?
Yeah, we tried putting even in. We have an invert system sometimes that we can have multiple cubicles to where we can throw even sometimes larger wrasses and things where they're forced into a small area to try to nip at them. And it's just not 100%. They don't seem to get in there as effectively as we would like. And again, the way we do things, we can't leave it to chance. I mean, it may thin them out, but they don't seem to go for the spiders as much in my experience. Now, there may be specific species of wrasses that are better than others. And I would suspect if they are, they're also the ones that would probably do a number on most of the invertebrates in the system in general. So, it's something to balance there.
Alex,
and also fish is such a small stomach, right? How much can they eat? They will get full.
Yeah,
easily.
yeah.
So it's not very effective.
Getting in and under and in between the polyps
is hard,
especially on some of those ones that can be slightly toxic. It's just not 100% on that. So it may help a little bit, but I don't think that's a solution.
Yeah. Alex, let me just say, Alex, if you wanted to send that thing to me via the private chat feature, you could also do that.
I just texted it to you.
Oh, okay, you just texted it. All right, go ahead, Dong. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. I think that sometimes Kevin, I think you're right about that. Some zoanthus actually can be quite toxic to the fish, right? So the fish can recognize not going after, not even want to go near some kind of zoanthus. So for example, that even the aptasia is eating filefish. So I have a rock with certain patty on it, and then you have some aptasia on it. But my filefish never even try to get close to that rock at all. That small piece of rock, I want him to eat that aptasia. No, he clean everything else. Just not going to go into that rock at all.
Yeah, or sometimes even on we've noticed torch corals would come in with some planaria on the tentacles, and if the dip didn't eradicate that the first round, because again they can shrink in. I think Alex has mentioned that earlier. Sometimes they can almost create a refuge where they're trapped and the dips can't effectively get to them as much. So they would require some more rounds of dips. But the planaria, you might have wrasses in that tank picking and dragonettes and all sorts of stuff, but they just won't go to the torch because just naturally the swaying and the stinging, it's just not easy prey for them, and they kind of learn to stay away from it. So it doesn't seem to do the job there. A lot of times, hydrogen peroxide is even something we've used pretty effectively to almost get the flatworms to float right off. It sort of latches on planaria and just lifts them right off. And if you were to put it into a bin of water and let the coral open up and then add the dip while the coral's still open, sometimes that can help too.
So talk about the torch. So is there some of the flatworm actually live inside the gut of the torch? Is that possibility?
I wouldn't say in the gut, but in the actual polyp tissue, yes.
inside the mouth.
Digestive enzymes, I've never seen it. Because again, I think once there's enough tissue in the coral and the tentacles, there's enough space for them to live. I don't think they're actually in where the digestive enzymes are, but they can be pretty far down into that coral polyp.
Oh, yeah. Because the reason I ask is that I think that, well, 2 or 3 years ago, and there's a guy actually, he brought me a piece of gold torch that he just purchased. The thing doesn't open, so he wanted me to look at it. So I put the torch in a container and add some iodine on it, and then the polyp actually is opened up halfway, and then we saw those flatworm actually crawling from the mouth, from inside the torch coming out, and that guy's, oh, he's so grossed out. He said, toss it. He cannot stand it anymore. That's why I ask: is that possible that actually the flatworm actually live inside the tissue, so they can crawl out from the mouth? Because we did see one example like that. Maybe it's just accidental that happened, or you actually.
I mean, I guess anything's possible.
I was going to say, Chris from ACS says boring worms are the biggest killer of wild torches. Hey, Alex, I got your text here. What are we looking at here?
So it's another alveolopora nudibranch that came in on a pink colony of alveolopora, and it's actually like the actual tentacles on it looks like the polyps of the coral tissue is on. I mean, it just shows like how camouflaged some of these pests can be.
Yeah, I mean, possibly
it's not working.
Similar to the zoonudies, where they would absorb the pigments and potentially use that as camouflage too. I wonder if it's a different species or if they're just doing that as well.
And sometimes even like using like black light can be really beneficial in finding some of these. Yeah,
there we go.
This is.
Oh yeah, I think those
even
look a lot
different. Yeah, so on the actual coral, it was very difficult to see.
Yeah, there's some crazy ones that camouflage. Have you seen the star polyp nudies? They literally look like exact replicas of the star polyps. It's insane how close those ones are, and difficult to spot. But a lot of times the good thing is most of those just blow right off very easily with the dips, especially if you're basting. So usually the nudies aren't too much of a headache for us to remove when we're bringing in a lot of new shipments.
Kevin, what is this? The Triton, Opsis elegans, what soft coral eating? That's another type of nudibranch. Yeah,
that was one that we stumbled upon once, I think, in the last year. Not something we encounter often, which is again why I sent the picture, just to show some different stuff out there.
Do you happen to save these nudibranchs when you find them?
You know what, my crew, we're all geeks in this stuff. So anytime they see something new, they get excited. They pull it off. We do some research, try to get slides like this. We're trying to grow a general database of all the pests we find, eventually with the goal to share that resource on our website. But we keep it long enough to at least run some tests on it and see which dips are effective and that sort of thing. But if it's not something we encounter long-term, there's only so much we could do with that. And as much as I'd like to set up a bunch of little experiment tanks and throw different stuff in there, we have a lot of things on our plate. So it's not always
no, absolutely.
On the agenda.
If you're not seeing it a lot, it makes sense not to go to extreme lengths for it. I'm just saying, if you have parasites in the future, I do have a parasite collection, so I would happily take them off your hands.
Okay, yeah, that's something we could work out. Maybe ship them over.
Because a lot of the times you guys get to see a lot of the cool stuff that doesn't make it to. Again, you guys especially do a great job at preventing, spread. So it makes my job easier and a little less exciting because I don't get to see the cool parasites that you guys have already, cleared. So yeah, again, if you have anything that you want to save, you can always throw it in a little bit of vodka and send it my way.
Yeah. All right. What about this one? A grimace flatworm. Is that you guys just made that name up or something?
Yeah, that was a term because we couldn't with 100% certainty find an identification that was out there.
That looks like a badass acro-eating flatworm.
It acts similar to an acro-eating flatworm, but they were different, harder to spot. The eggs, they laid sometimes further than what you would typically see on the acro-eating flatworms. Typically with an acro flatworm, it would be, egg laying right at the edge where the base is and the coral tissue kind of stops, and they would sort of be eaten away from the bottom up. Sometimes these would even lay the eggs on the racks and that kind of thing. So
Really? Wow.
yeah, a little bit further away. So it was
That's scary.
One of those ones that's more scary. But again, when you know what you're looking for and you have a proper protocol where you're doing the tank transfers, that's where that is really key. And with acros, like Dong had mentioned, removing pretty much any part of that's not live coral tissue generally eliminates a lot of the egg transfer during that phase. But these things were difficult too. It seemed like the reproduced faster, to the point where rather than once a week, we were dipping twice a week just to make sure that they were disappearing. And once we got that figured out, we haven't really seen them coming in often, but I have to dig through my notes to figure out exactly which region they were coming from. I don't remember if it was coming in on Aussie stuff or if it was on the Indo, but maybe if you follow up with me later, I can find those notes.
Do you know if they were like really fast moving or are they like quick slow?
Pretty fast
like compared
moving.
to other flats.
Yeah, pretty fast moving once you get them going.
When you mean pretty fast moving, what do you mean, Kevin?
Being, not where they just sort of latch on and only move if you baste them off. You can, if you watch them, like I think what Alex had mentioned, kind of laying them out and taking a time lapse, you would definitely see them, but you wouldn't even have to use a time lapse to see them moving.
Yeah, because every acro-eating flatworm I've seen, and I don't know how many varieties I've seen. I've never seen that dark center coloration, which seems definitely different.
And it was harder to spot on the tissue of the coral too, sometimes depending on the color, that it would come in on those shipments. So yeah, that would be, a little strange there, maybe different. If it was on came in on, let's say, certain colors, though, it would look brighter and easier to see. So definitely something different than your standard acro-eating flatworm. But hey, there's probably way more predators out there than we even know of yet. And that's why we're always looking over everything. And, generally the rule of thumb we use is if you don't know what it is, don't take a chance.
Kill it.
Just remove it. Yeah, pretty much. Or send it to Alex.
Yeah. So, Kevin, do you find that the UV light actually can help you to light up these flatworms? Or
Identify them?
Yeah, actually, there's a guy said that he used those urine detector, the little UV flashlight, and then he can find flatworm much easier.
To be honest, that's not a method we've used, but we did pick up a UV light for some other reasons. So that might be a technique we'll have to incorporate. I'm interested to see how it works. I mean, typically we crank the white lights up all the way. It tends to be much easier to spot the pests on that spectrum for us versus a lot of the heavy typical blue light spectrums that the reef tank would be running on.
So actually, that I do have. That's the thing that actually he showed me. So I bought one myself. So I only use it to detect my cat's pee, but
well, hopefully you don't see too many spots around that.
So he said that at night I use this. Unfortunately, my cats are not very disciplined. So he told me that to use this to look at the base of the coral on the rock at night when light is out. So then you probably can spot something that is actually. This is not the blue light though. This is a 365 nanometer light. So instead of the 390. So of course this light will give you the horror. It's a horror show if you shine it in your bathroom. It's going to be like a murder scene.
I might have to take that to some of the hotels when I'm traveling too.
Oh my goodness,
that's probably a bad idea.
What kind of hotels you
I don't know. When you're on the road,
I
sometimes
say every
you
hotel.
do what you can.
Yeah, right. One other pest that you sent a picture for Kevin was these clove polyp eating sea slugs, and I've never heard of those.
Mm-hmm.
Clove polyp eating sea slug. How big is that? How big are those slugs?
I think I've seen them probably get about yay long. We don't bring in that many wild cloves, so it's not something we deal with often. But when we do, I have seen them fairly often on that. And they are pretty easy to get rid of too. I mean, again, most of your standard dips will knock them off. And, with those repetitive dips, typically they'll just kind of run their course and go away. So it's not really anything that we worry too much about, but I would be cautious taking wild ones in, because I would say probably, 1 in 4 wild colonies, I would see those pop up. And that would be even after dipping them on intake and inspecting them sometimes. So it would be in a small holding system, and then all of a sudden you see something crawling around. The underside is bright white, so if they're on the glass, sometimes migrating, it would just look almost white like that.
So Kevin, did you see them more on mariculture coral versus wild coral, or the basically is just the same chance? So is that mariculture coral has a different type of?
Yeah, I think most of the cloves coming in are being maricultured now. Mm-hmm. So I'd say that's probably mostly all I've been getting. So I couldn't tell you 100%. Sure, some of the coral importers would have a little bit more knowledge when it comes to that kind of thing, on what they see them on the most. But I would say we have, I think right now, 4 fully aquacultured strains of different varieties of cloves, and that's pretty much it. And they're rock solid. Mm-hmm. We just don't really bring in as much of that, so it's not something we deal with as often. Versus the different types of individual acros, I think we have well over 100 in our collection. So, just not dealing with them that often.
Let me ask you guys, just changing gears a little bit here in terms of pests that we should be worried about. Fireworms, bristleworms.
Mm-hmm.
Concern? They can get big.
It depends. Like, I've seen people go, oh, it's eating coral tissue versus it's not eating coral tissue. I am in the camp that they're opportunistic predators. If there's already dying coral tissue, yes, it may consume like dead coral tissue, but I think people immediately don't acknowledge that the coral was already dying and now it's just consuming the dead tissue. I've seen on rare occasion like some burrowing wrasses end up getting quilled in the face, so like that's definitely a possibility. And let's say you're some of those tanks that have hundreds if not thousands of bristleworms, like the constant irritation of being crawled on. But it's not something that I generally panic about.
Yeah, they could be beneficial detrivores in the tank, so it's not necessarily something to panic about. I would say I have personally had some experience with clams in the sand bed. Even a healthy clam, I noticed they seem to be digging up into the base tissue, and I don't think it was already on its way out. Though typically I do think you're 100% correct on decaying and dying things, or a fish dies and you see a bristleworm on it. Yeah, the bristleworm didn't do that. It's just eating the leftovers. But yeah, I'd be a little cautious with clams if you have some big monsters there and there's a heavy population. Unfortunately, most dips don't kill bristleworms outside of main ones. Bear was pretty effective on that. I'm not sure if you've found anything else that's worked pretty well on those, Alex.
Generally, I'm not trying to kill them, but the bear dip sometimes does. I know some people have gone as heavy as like ivermectin, but that's like taking a shotgun. But again, if you really hate them that much, it's not something I recommend, but I've seen people do it.
Go nuclear.
So again, the ivermectin, and there's a lot of people in that camp. Yeah, it kills things, a lot of different things. again, if you want to take the nuclear approach, then yeah, you can definitely do that. But it's not something that I really am killing a lot. Again, because I do think that they do have their place in terms of just breaking down organic matter.
I mean, you could trap them too, right? I mean, if you got like big ass
I've
fireworm or
I've
bristleworm.
I've bought 3 different traps where you put the silver sides, you put the food in, it's got the little holes that 3D printed cage. I've seen other people, it worked phenomenally. It's never worked for me. I don't know what I'm doing wrong in that regard. But I see other people swear by it. I've tried many different types and different shapes and sizes, and they've never worked for me.
So I have the ultimate bristleworm trap. My personal aquarium at home years back, one day, the return pump quit. I didn't notice it until the next morning. And I had an auto feeder apex dumping into the pump zone pellets that shoot into the display tank typically. So the pellets went into the pump zone. And I have a refugium attached adjacent to that. So I go and look at the pump. I'm about to reach in to remove that pump, and I see just a pile. It was insane. Just literally like a nightmare scene out of Indiana Jones with the snakes, where they're just all over the return pump. Oof. It was insane, just monsters. I couldn't believe it. And literally every one that was in the refugium ran out and into that pump zone trying to go for all that pellet food in that short period of time. So, that might work for you if you want to try that route. Otherwise, in the past, in some of my early reef tanks, I had some monsters that were, getting over 6 inches long, and I would try to lure them out with food and then go in with the tweezers and try to grab them. A lot of times, if they aren't out far enough, they just rip off and go back into the rock, and you'd be a little short. But if you have an adequate cleaner crew, I think with enough competition where you're not going to have a ton of leftover food too, your populations won't get out of control. My early reef tank, I would say I was slacking a little bit on the hermit crab restocking and, some of the Neisseria snails and things like that might help clean things up, which could help compete with those bristleworms and not just let the population get out of hand. And that being said, too, if you are doing small frags when you're quarantining stuff, it's pretty hard to miss a bristleworm when you're bringing in things like that, too. It's usually on rocks, things like that can be boring into and hiding in crevices and nooks and crannies. So, again, more of the wild coral and bigger pieces would be more the threat when it comes to quarantine in regards to those.
Are you guys advocates of starting a tank with dry rock versus live rock to minimize the potential of introducing pests? Or does it not matter?
There's pluses and minuses to both. Yes, I feel like us as a hobby, understanding like the microbiome has like been, the new hot topic. And I think it's something that we're really lacking as a hobby understanding. So when we use already, really established rock, are we adding things that may be really beneficial at the same time? Are we adding things that we shouldn't be? And I don't think any over-the-counter product yet is comparable to using live rock in that regard. So there's pluses and minuses to both. Fortunately, I haven't had to set up a tank in quite some time, so I'm living off the live rock that I have. But is it nice to have like a quarantine system? But again, are we missing certain bacterial components that we're not getting supplementing with the, like pre-made bacterial bottles?
Yeah, I think you're right. I do sort of miss the days of the really nice natural live rock that we would get where you could throw it in. I didn't even know what dinos were when I was a young hobbyist. It really wasn't something that you encountered that much.
No.
That being said, for our fully quarantined systems, we did start all those with, 100% dry rock and sterile, and we had to build it up over time. And we did have to go through a lot of those ugly phases and, mix in a lot of bacteria and that sort of thing. Whereas now what we do, if we're trying to jumpstart some of those, is we'll take mature biomedia from different systems and spread that around to different tanks. We even did bring in some of the cultured live rock that they're doing with Marco, to where they're planting that in the wild. And the stuff we bring in is very, very small rubble rock. So you get a lot of the good benefits of the microbiome that's coming in similar to live rock, but they're so small, the pieces, that it's much easier to make sure there's no hitchhikers and that kind of thing that you would have to worry about getting into your tank. So it's a little easier to manage that. So if you start dry, I would recommend maybe throwing a little bit of those pre-treated live rock pieces in there just to give it that boost, and probably even some mature biomedia as well if you have a thriving system that you're not worried about transferring anything over from.
Kevin, are you guys still doing those kick-ass aquascapes, the minimal aquascapes? Is that something that you guys are still offering customers?
Yeah, those aquascapes,
those things are
that's
sick, man.
Sort of a little passion project of mine. It's something that I do to, let out my artistic side sometimes. So, I have fun with that, making some pretty interesting, rock structures and sculptures. And, those same deal is if we're starting a tank and using those, we would sprinkle some of that live rock in, the filter compartment, some of the biomedia in there as well. That's what we typically recommend. And a lot of times we'd even take, some chips of coralline algae, that kind of thing, scatter them around the tank to give it a little boost as well. Just getting as much in there as you can to speed up that process. But, even with the dry rock, you will go through a little bit more of those ugly stages than you would otherwise. Some people would even take a rock structure, let's say you have a big tank, maybe even throw it in a barrel and just mature that rock in there for months ahead of time. I mean, I've known people who do that who aren't in a rush, and they just kind of slow mature it on the side and then gradually build it up rather than just throwing it in and getting coral and light on it immediately. So there are a lot of ways to go about that.
So Kevin, you should sell those live rock chips. They should be easy to ship. You should sell them.
He does.
The rock structures?
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
The little chips, the little piece of live rock.
Coralline algae and the rubble rock?
No, the rubble rock.
Yeah, we do offer that on the website now.
Oh, okay.
We also sell the biomedia too. So the biomedia that's been maturing typically for, I think, a minimum of 3 to 6 months, we offer that up just to help give people a boost.
Yeah.
For tanks.
So this is kind of a good, I think, question to kind of end it on. And we talked about some dips throughout this very fascinating talk, by the way. I think I've learned a lot by listening to what you guys have to say in terms of all this stuff. And people, I think, man is like, wonder how many people will be searching for pests in their tanks tonight, for sure. But
Guess
in terms of like
cats, huh?
Yeah, right. But in terms of what you guys would recommend to people and for dipping corals coming into their systems, what we talked about a number of different dips, but if they had to like pick a couple of dips, I mean, I guess there's only so many dips you could run corals through when you're bringing them into a tank. You don't want to like put them through too much. If you guys had to give advice in terms of a dip or two for people to utilize for both LPS and acro softies, what have you, what would be your go-to dips?
I would probably say
curious to see what his answer was first.
Potassium chloride or reef primer, mostly for acros. A lot of times the softies we use Coral RX, but we do a higher concentration, a lot of times double the dose with that. And yeah, I'd say that's the main ones we use on intake. If you didn't have a quarantine tank, what I would also recommend, let's say you're going to put it in your tank after the dip and you have a handful of zoas, don't put it right by your zoa garden. Maybe put it in the opposite corner of the tank. So there's less of a chance if there was something lingering. Now, maybe the dip killed it, but if eggs hatched, then they would have to migrate all the way across the tank to get on those. So it's a little less risky if you don't have a QT tank doing it that way.
For me, it changes daily. I don't think there's no one best. If there was a best, everyone would be using it. I think each one of them have their own benefits and different scenarios. So for me, it's whatever also you're more comfortable using, right? There's no data to say that, okay, 10 acros died when we used Malflex, and 10 acros died, or 9 acros died when we did Coralax, and 5 did this. So there's no data. But for me, I do use a lot of Malaflix just because I find it incredibly irritating for copapods and flatworms. But that doesn't mean that that's the best. It's just what I'm comfortable using and what I've had good experience with. I think the dip isn't the most important part. It's the observation. It's what's happening to the coral in the dip, what organisms are coming off in the dip. So again, it doesn't matter. Again, I've seen freshwater that works just as well as Coral X, that works as Malaflix. It's how observant are you to what's happening in the situation. Just because I dip something doesn't mean that it's clean. I'm dipping something to look for something, expect to find something. It's very rare that you dip a coral and there's nothing on it. It doesn't mean that it's not a beneficial copepod, but if you're constantly dipping corals and you say there's nothing there, then you're not looking, right? There's always going to be some sort of algae tissue. There's going to be, beneficial copepods, and at least identify them and go, this copepod, I'm looking at something, it's abnormal, or it's something that's moving on the coral. What is it? And go through the entire coral in like a very systematic manner, rather than, say someone swishes around for 2 seconds and then goes, oh, it's clean. When you're done, look through that bucket, right? I like using like a white bucket. So if there's anything on the bottom of the bucket, I go, okay, what's that color contrast? How does my eyes adjust? Again, looking at different levels in the water, not just at the bottom, but is there something floating on the top? Is there something swimming in the middle? And again, looking quickly in a bucket, I find that you'll miss a lot of these things. That's like sitting there for, a good period of time. Again, there's certain corals where we'll have like an acro frag that's like 1 inch by 1 inch, and it'll take me 15 minutes before I'm comfortable saying that there's nothing there, because it's essentially using the different microscopy, using your eyes, focusing at different focal planes. Because if I look at an acro here, if there's something, just past where my eyes are focusing, I'm not going to see that subtle movement. So it's like really being essentially over the top in your examination, and whatever dip that you're using, again, use that as part of your examination. Again, it doesn't matter what that dip is necessarily, as long as we're identifying the abnormalities or any living organism on an acro, right? If you have an acro frag, any living organism, should it be there? Should it not? And as Kevin said before, if you don't know, just get rid of it. Worst case scenario, you got rid of a beneficial copepod, right? Again, should we kill things unnecessarily? As a vet, I have to say no, but as a risk management, absolutely. Everything that you don't know what it is, don't put it in your tank.
And there's a lot of things in the tank.
Yeah, I saw there's one YouTube video, actually a YouTuber. What he does is that every week he flushes his whole tank with interceptor. Every week.
Extreme.
Look like, well, that's pretty extreme, I think. I think that there will be, in that case, there will be no live copepod in there, right? Basically everything.
Yeah, I would say, why would he do that? Why not just get an intake tank and do it during that process? And then
because he said that by doing that, he gets the best polyp extension. That's his rationale.
I mean, like he mentioned, and we've kind of noticed, we theorized that the beef flavoring in the interceptor can sometimes get a feeding reaction or a feeding response from some of the corals. But you can always just sprinkle in some other food.
Yeah, exactly.
That seemed a bit extreme there. And then, you would be wiping out a lot of beneficial critters as well in that system. So, that's why we try to always do it on intake. And then that way we don't have to treat it in our grow out systems.
I had one more question, and Dong, I don't know if you had any more questions you wanted to ask.
Go ahead.
My quick question is cleanup crew. I know that snails can bring in certain fish pathogens, but is that also a concern with corals in terms of anything pest-wise that could come into a tank? Do we need to be really thinking a lot about where we're getting our cleanup crews from?
It depends on like how paranoid you want to be. Like there's a certain level of like perfect biosecurity and like perfect level of paranoia where, I've seen ick come in on coral. I would have believed it if I didn't see it with my own eyes. There's a certain point where you go, okay, do you quarantine, your snails and crabs for 90 days? And the paranoid perfect answer is yes. Practically, is that an option for most people? No, right? Yes, there's risks. There's always risks with everything we do, but there's a certain point where the paranoia is counterintuitive and no longer productive, right? There's a certain point where my tank's at home. I don't want to add anything. I don't want to put another thing because I know that I'm stable right now. But again, there's a certain point where I go, okay, I'm not adding, hermit crabs because I'm scared to bring something in, and now I'm having algae problems. And it's like weighing the risks, and the risks are very, very low. But as long as we acknowledge that they're there, and if we ever see, mild, like displays of parasitism, then acknowledging them quickly and finding if there's potential parasitism. So if there's a coral, all of a sudden it's not looking good, again, pull it out, examine it, or at a bare minimum, again, if you can't get it out, try somehow using like, a waterproof phone or something like that, try to get underneath it, look for, signs of parasitism, rather than just ignoring it. I think as long as we are, you don't just get acropore flatworms in a day. A coral doesn't die in a day from it, right? It's a slow process. So again, acknowledging that process is there and dealing with it before it's too late is the key with that. At least my take on it.
Yeah, my take, I would say I'm a bit more in the tinfoil hat, paranoid type. Now, I have to be, because of the way we run our farm and what's at stake. That being said, we're mostly worried about coral-specific pests. So we just don't transfer invertebrates from systems that aren't quarantined with those corals in it. So if it's just a blank slate invertebrate system with stuff coming in from the wild, we don't keep acros in that. So I'm not really worried about acro pests getting transferred in, or we're not keeping a lot of these different LPS corals that are coming in with these pods. So I'm not worried about them getting transferred from the inverts into these other systems. That being said, our QT systems, we do basic inspection where we'll, look them over, brush them off, that kind of thing. But mostly what we see would be hitchhiking in on the inverts would be some algae, Asterina starfish, sometimes, Aptasia and things like that. Sometimes even bristleworms, getting in the shells and that sort of thing. But those aren't the type of pests that are the coral specific ones that are, to the point that we would QT all our inverts and be doing anything drastic to the level of dipping them in any kind of way. We're just trying to keep coral specific pests out of those systems that could take down our collection and cause issues there. So we just don't pull from wild systems. If I had an intake system, I would never just take the hermits from there and just chuck them in one of our other tanks once the intake was done. We just wouldn't do it that way to, mitigate that risk.
Makes sense. Hey, Dong, you have anything else you wanted to ask? Did we covered a lot of territory, I know that.
Yeah, Oh, actually, one thing is that for the in local fish store, you can see that they have some store has a bubbler with copepod in it, or the copepod in a bottle. So is there a chance that when people buy those commercial copepod, can introduce parasitic one in their tank?
Generally, if it's a clean culture, no.
Okay. So
all those are being cultured for a specific strain, and in addition to that, they're in an environment where there wouldn't be any corals to prey upon. So they're not those types of species that do prey on the corals. So they're very particular. I mean, we even do that ourselves. I'm sure you've seen Taras in some of the videos with the different pods and phytoplankton that we grow, and they are looked through with a microscope, and it's all pure cultures, and there's never anything really mixed in with those batches at all. So pods are good generally, just not the bad one.
And we're gonna have Taras on next month.
Yeah, but that'll be fun.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, listen, guys. I think, like I mentioned before, to me, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot, and we appreciate you guys spending some time with us to educate us a little bit more on all this stuff. It is pretty wild in terms of how many different things we have to be concerned about. And it's always something with a reef tank, right? In terms of parasites and pests, there's endless numbers of them, and you just have to be diligent and patient and don't get frustrated, and be in it for the long haul.
Yeah, if it were easy, everyone would do it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
and you'd see a nice reef tank and PetSmart.
Well, listen, thanks again, guys, for being on the stream. I also want to thank our sponsors one more time. Polo Reef, make sure to check out Polo Reef's latest YouTube videos. At Polo Reef, nothing is ever basic. Join Andrew as he shares updates and behind-the-scenes insights on some of this year's most jaw-dropping reef aquarium moments, from major milestones with the iconic 17,000-gallon tank to a surprising lab leak, the challenges of the 900-gallon glass drop-down build, and the revival of a 2,500-gallon reef that sat empty for a decade. Make sure to subscribe to their YouTube channel at Polo Reef for video drop notifications. Flow is very important for keeping corals happy. In a reef, growing corals can block flow from wave makers and create dead spots. That's about to change. The ocean sea wave will oscillate any wave maker or power head in your aquarium from 0 to 180 degrees at an adjustable speed. This creates natural dynamic flow patterns, reduces dead spots, and kicks up detritus. The ocean sea wave is available exclusively through Champion Lighting and Supply. Visit championlighting.com for more information. Big thank you to Paul, who is the moderator as well as the president of the Boston Reefer Society. Please join and support your local reefing clubs. They are so important to this hobby. Also want to let you know that all episodes of Rappin With ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. The next Rappin With ReefBum live stream will be Tuesday, August 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's the third Tuesday of every month. Our guests, I mentioned, Terrace will be on from Top Shelf Aquatics, Chad Clayton from Reef Nutrition, Phil Gilbert from Polyp Lab, and Kenneth Wingertner from Hydrospace. So we've got quite the panel for the next show. We'll be doing a deep dive on coral nutrition. So until then, be safe and be well, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.